Every month starts the same way. You promise yourself this time will be different. You'll save more. Worry less. Stop opening your banking app with that knot already in your stomach. For a few days it almost works. Then the bills arrive. And it's not the amount that hurts most. It's the feeling underneath it. That quiet dread creeping back in, like it never really left. If this sounds familiar, I need you to hear something almost no one will tell you. The problem was never that you don't work hard enough. Somewhere along the way you were taught that peace has to be earned through worry. That anxiety is simply what responsible people feel. But what if the cycle isn't happening because of what's in your bank account, but because of something that begins long before you ever look at the numbers? Nearly 100 years ago, Florence Scovel Shinn believed something few people dare to consider. Fear doesn't just follow scarcity. Sometimes it quietly helps keep it alive. Tonight we break that cycle. Not by pushing harder against it, by understanding what's spinning it. Let's slow down for a moment, because if you don't see what happens next, nothing Florence taught will make complete sense. Picture a woman. You don't need her name. You've probably met her, maybe in the mirror. Her day arrives. She unlocks her phone, opens the banking app, holds her breath for half a second before the number loads. And there it is, a number that, for a moment, feels like enough. Something in her chest loosens. She exhales, maybe allows herself something small. That relief doesn't last. Not because anything happened, no bill, no emergency. It shrinks because a quieter voice underneath is already doing the math. Rent, that card payment, the thing she forgot about. The number hasn't changed. But in her mind, it already became a warning. By the end of the week, the fear is back. Quiet, present, like something she's learned to live with. And here's the strange part. Fear quietly reaches for the steering wheel. And without realizing it, she lets it drive. She buys something she didn't plan to. Not from excess, but because for one moment, spending quieted the noise. She leaves an envelope unopened for 2 extra days. Not from carelessness, but because some part of her needs one more day of not knowing. She says yes to something she should have said no to, because saying no felt, in that moment, like one more loss she couldn't afford. Tiny decisions. Invisible decisions. The kind nobody remembers making. Yet each one quietly pushes the month in the same direction. Then the bills arrive, the ones that were always going to arrive. But they don't feel ordinary anymore. They feel like proof. And guilt follows close behind, the quiet kind. I should have managed this better, even when she did everything a reasonable person would do. Then a new month begins. The chest loosens. And the cycle starts again. Eventually people stop calling it a cycle. They call it personality. They call it responsibility. They call it adulthood. They call it life. But here's something worth noticing. Fear, once it's familiar enough, stops feeling like fear at all. It starts feeling like background noise, like the low hum of an old refrigerator in the corner of the room. After enough years you stop hearing it. Not because it's gone, 'cause it became normal. This is the part almost nobody tells you. The cycle doesn't begin with the bill. By the time the bill arrives, something has already been shaping the weeks before it. Quietly in the background, in decisions that never felt connected to money at all. Which raises a quieter question, and a much harder one to look away from. If fear has been shaping your decisions long before any number appeared on a screen, what else has it been deciding for you? Florence believed the answer begins much earlier than most people imagine. Almost 100 years ago, in a small apartment in New York, a woman sat at a wooden desk writing ideas most people would dismiss without a second thought. Her name was Florence Scovel Shinn. Say the name slowly, and it already sounds like something you weren't supposed to find. What she wrote wasn't mystical. It wasn't strange. It was simple enough to be dangerous, because if she was right, millions of people had been fighting the wrong battle their entire lives. Now let's be honest about the word in the title. Ban. It wasn't ban the way a book gets pulled from a shelf. Nothing in her writings suggests she was silenced by any institution, or that her work was forbidden in any official sense. That's not the story here. What was banned, quietly, informally, the way certain ideas get banned, was a way of thinking. Again and again, Florence returned to the same observation. People quietly expect what they fear, and then mistake the outcome for fate. Because here's what nobody tells you about the world Florence lived in, and honestly, the world most of us still live in. Worry was never treated as a mistake. It was treated as a virtue. The responsible thing. The mature thing. Of course you check the account with dread. Of course you brace for the bill before it arrives. Anything else would be naive. Florence looked at that belief, the one everyone around her accepted as common sense, and quietly rejected it. Not loudly. She wasn't interested in arguments. She simply lived and taught a different way of relating to money, one so far outside what people considered realistic that it might as well have been forbidden. That's the secret this video is named for. Not a hidden text. Not a suppressed teaching. A way of thinking that most people were never given permission to try. So who was she really? Florence Scovel Shinn began her career as an illustrator, not a teacher. She spent years painting the world she saw around her. Faces, scenes, the visible surface of things. It wasn't until later in life that she turned to something less visible. The forces underneath the surface. The patterns that shape a person's circumstances long before those circumstances ever appear. She wrote small books. Modest ones by today's standards. No elaborate systems, no complicated rituals. Just short, direct observations about the relationship between the inner life and the outer one. Over the years, many of her ideas were reduced to simple slogans. Attract abundance, think positively, visualize success. But Florence herself was aiming at something much deeper than slogans. She was pointing at the actual mechanism running quietly behind every financial decision a person makes, whether they realize it or not. Most people believe circumstances come first, and feelings follow. I'm anxious because my bank account is low. That seems obvious. That seems like common sense. Florence taught something almost backward. Not that circumstances don't matter, they do. But that the state of mind a person carries day after day tends to shape how situations unfold, what opportunities get noticed, what decisions get made under pressure, and where life quietly ends up over time. She never claimed this was easy to accept. She knew it went against nearly everything people were taught to believe about money, effort, and struggle. And that mechanism has a name. Florence called it something closer to a law about expectation, and what it quietly builds in a life, one repeated thought at a time. We're about to look at that law directly. And once you see it, you'll understand why so many people keep working harder, while unknowingly strengthening the very cycle they're trying to escape. But first, sit with this for one moment. What if the habit you've been calling realism has quietly been writing your financial future for years? Florence believed every person lives under an invisible law, one we reinforce every single day without realizing it. It begins with something so ordinary that almost nobody questions it. Expectation. Have you ever bought a new car and suddenly started seeing that same model everywhere? On the highway, in parking lots, parked outside your neighbor's house. The cars weren't new. Your attention was. Florence believed money works in much the same way. What you consistently expect quietly determines what your attention begins collecting. Let's make that concrete. She walks into the grocery store already expecting there won't be enough. So her eyes don't land on the discounts. They land on the prices. She checks her bank balance, and the first number she looks for isn't what's there. It's what's missing. She opens an email already braced for bad news, and her eyes skip straight past the sentence that says, "We'd like to offer," because she's already scanning for the word, unfortunately. Expectation quietly edits reality before reality has a chance to speak. It doesn't stop at attention. It reaches into decisions too. If she expects an opportunity to fall through, she hesitates at the exact moment boldness was needed, and the hesitation becomes the reason it falls through. If she expects to be shortchanged, she reads every conversation looking for the shortchange, and usually finds it because she was the only one looking. None of this is a conscious choice. It's closer to a posture, the tightening in her chest when an unknown number calls, the "we'll see" instead of "yes" when someone mentions an opportunity, the quiet reflex to assume the estimate will be higher, the good month a fluke that won't repeat. Florence's insight was that this posture doesn't just describe a financial life. Over time, it participates in shaping it. Attention becomes a quiet lawyer, gathering evidence for whatever the mind already believes. Decisions bend around what she's braced for instead of what's actually in front of her. And decisions, repeated enough times, quietly become a life. Trying harder while carrying the same posture simply produces the same month, with more exhaustion attached to it. She wasn't asking anyone to pretend everything was fine. She was asking for something far more precise. A willingness to notice the bracing itself, and to consider seriously that it might be doing more than describing the circumstances, might be shaping them. Florence often invited people to imagine the mind as a garden. Every thought planted something. Every repeated fear watered it. Every expectation gave it sunlight. The garden never stopped growing. It simply grew whatever it was consistently given. But Florence also described another image, one that explains financial anxiety even better. Once you see it, it's almost impossible to unsee. Florence invited people to picture something surprisingly ordinary. Wheel, always turning. Expectation turns the axle. The axle turns the wheel. The wheel produces fearful decisions. Fearful decisions create scarcity. Scarcity strengthens the expectation that started everything. And the wheel gathers speed. Nobody blames the wheel for spinning. That's what wheels do. They simply obey whatever is happening at the center. The natural instinct is always the same. Work longer. Live harder. Push against the problem with even more effort. And it never works for long. Not because effort doesn't matter, it does. But because pushing against the rim doesn't touch what's actually turning it. Every time the wheel completes another turn, it becomes a little easier to believe it has always been this way. After enough years, people stop seeing the wheel. They simply call it reality. The tragedy is that most people spend their lives polishing the rim, budgeting harder, working longer, tightening every corner, while the axle keeps turning underneath, quietly deciding the direction of the next month. Expectation lives at the center. Fear is only what you hear while the wheel is turning. Touch the axle and the whole will change its speed. Leave it untouched, and you can polish the rim for the rest of your life without ever slowing it down. This is why so many well-meaning efforts to fix money problems don't last. A person cuts spending out of fear, and feels a small relief, until the fear finds something new to attach itself to. A person works a second job out of fear, exhausts themselves completely, and still lies awake with the same tight chest they had before the extra hours. The circumstances change. The axle doesn't. If this wheel has been turning in your own life, write one sentence in the comments. Today I begin my prosperity cycle. Every lasting change begins with a moment like this. The moment you stop treating the old pattern as permanent. Florence believed the moment a person begins to expect something other than lack, genuinely, quietly, consistently, not as a performance but as a real shift in posture, the axle itself begins to slow. Not instantly, not dramatically, but the way a heavy wheel slows once whatever was driving it stops feeding it speed. Understanding the wheel is one thing. Recognizing your own axle is something else. Because once you find it, you'll realize your mind has been answering the same question every single day. It just wasn't the question you thought you were asking. Every will has a beginning. Nobody is born expecting lack. A child does not look at the world and assume there will never be enough. That expectation is learned, quietly, long before anyone realizes they are learning it. Think about the first time she felt that particular knot in her stomach. Money running short, a parent's voice a little tighter than usual, a small silence at the dinner table where an answer should have been. She was young. She didn't understand the details, but she understood the feeling. And the feeling stayed, long after the details were forgotten. The mind does something remarkable with moments like that. It doesn't file them away as one bad week in an otherwise ordinary childhood. Files them as a lesson. This is what happens with money. This is what it feels like when it runs out. Stay alert. And the mind, once it learns a lesson like that, doesn't need to be taught it twice. Here's where it gets interesting. Every time life offered even a small echo of that old feeling, a tight month, an unexpected expense, a friend's offhand comment about their own struggles, the mind reached for the same file. I know this. I felt this before. And each time it reached for that file, the groove got a little deeper, a little harder to distinguish from simple, sober realism. No one chooses this consciously. The mind simply repeats whatever helped it feel prepared the last time. This is closer to something almost mechanical, the way a path through tall grass becomes a trail, and the trail becomes the only way anyone thinks to walk. Florence described this decades before psychology developed the language we often use today. She simply called it repetition. A thought repeated enough times stops feeling like a thought at all, starts feeling like the truth. This is why the woman checking her banking app doesn't experience her dread as a belief. She experiences it as information, as something the account is telling her, rather than something she's bringing to the account. The dread arrived so early, and has been reinforced so many times, that it no longer announces itself as an opinion. It simply shows up first, before anything else has a chance to. Watch what this does to a single ordinary moment. A client sends a message that simply says, "Can we talk?" Nothing else. No tone. No context. Just 3 words on a screen. Someone whose mind has spent years rehearsing scarcity reads those words and immediately hears, "They're canceling. They found someone cheaper. This is the client I'm about to lose." The chest tightens before the phone call even happens. The message could have meant anything. Compliment. Referral. A scheduling question. But the wheel doesn't wait for information. It already knows how the story ends, because it's told itself this particular story so many times before. This is what Florence meant when she said expectation shapes experience. The message was real. But the meaning attached to it, that came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the groove. And here's the part this whole video has been building toward. If a groove like that was built, one repetition at a time, it can also be rebuilt. Not erased. Grooves this old rarely disappear completely, but worn down gradually the same way they were worn in. The wheel slows in a quieter way. It slows the moment you recognize the groove while you're still inside it. Instead of following the old path automatically, you ask a different question. A question powerful enough to interrupt years of repetition. We'll get to that exact question soon. But first, there are signs. Quiet ones, easy to overlook because they feel too ordinary to mean anything. And chances are, you've lived through at least 3 of them this week without realizing what they were. Remember the 3 signs from a moment ago. Here they are. The first, the tiny hesitation before opening the banking app. Not fear exactly. Just a half-second delay, a small bracing before the screen loads. Most people don't even register it as fear. They just call it checking the balance. The second, the specific dread of paying bills, even the ones she's fully able to cover. Not the bill itself. The moment right before. Opening the envelope, clicking the link, watching the number leave the account. A tightness that arrives regardless of how much is actually there. The third, the reflex thought, arriving uninvited, usually at the worst possible time. It's gonna run out. Not triggered by anything specific. No emergency. No warning sign. Just a sentence the mind hands over, almost on schedule, the way a radio hums static between stations. There's a fourth one too, quieter than the rest, and easy to mistake for good character. The guilt that shows up after buying something simple. Not extravagant. Not reckless. Coffee. Book. A small kindness toward herself. And right behind it, a whisper. You shouldn't have. None of these moments look like a cycle from the inside. They look like caution, like responsibility, like being a grown woman who takes money seriously. But notice what they have in common. Each one arrives before anything has actually gone wrong. The dread precedes the evidence. The guilt precedes the mistake. The bracing precedes the bill. That's the groove, showing itself in daylight. And here's what almost nobody says out loud. Recognizing these signs isn't the same as being weak, or ungrateful, or bad with money. It's simply the moment the wheel becomes visible, for maybe the first time in years. Which means it's also the first moment it can actually begin to slow. Because Florence believed something worth sitting with here. You cannot interrupt a pattern you've never allowed yourself to see clearly. Now that you can see it, it's time to talk about how she taught people to step out of it. Everything we've explored so far has been preparing you for this moment. Because understanding the wheel is valuable. But slowing it requires something different. Many people have had the same experience. They repeat affirmations for weeks. And nothing seems to change. Say, I am wealthy, to a mind quietly convinced of the opposite, and something in you pushes back. Not because you're negative, but because the mind checks new information against what it already holds as true. Florence often encouraged people to interrupt fearful mental habits by introducing a different inner conversation. One way to do that, and one that fits beautifully with the spirit of her teaching, is through a sincere question. Here's why that matters. A statement asks the mind to accept something. Question asks the mind to search. And the mind cannot leave a real question unanswered for long. Ask yourself something sincerely, and some part of you keeps working on it while you drive, while you cook, while you sleep, long after you've consciously stopped thinking about it. So tonight, instead of telling yourself something you may not yet believe, ask yourself something instead. Here is the question. How can I access the wealth that is already my birthright? Read it again slowly. Notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't claim you're already wealthy. It doesn't ask you to pretend the bills don't exist. It simply assumes something quieter, and in its own way more radical, that abundance isn't something foreign you have to chase down. It's something already yours by nature, currently just harder to access than it should be. Let's walk through it together the way you'd actually do this tonight. Find a quiet moment. After this video ends is perfect. Sit somewhere you won't be interrupted. You don't need candles or a particular posture. Florence's practices were never about performance. Just stillness and honesty. Close your eyes if that feels comfortable. And ask quietly, how can I access the wealth that is already my birthright? Then, and this is the part almost everyone rushes, don't answer it. Your job is only to ask, not to solve. Don't reach for a solution, a plan, a next step. Just ask and let it sit there, the way you drop a stone into still water and simply watch the ripples move outward. Sit with the silence for a moment, 30 seconds, minute. You're not doing anything wrong if nothing happens. Nothing is supposed to happen yet. Now, something important, something too many videos in this space promise dishonestly. I won't tell you an answer will arrive tonight in a dream, or that you'll wake up with a clear plan already formed. What actually tends to happen is quieter, and more valuable. You stop lying awake desperately hunting for a way out, and you start resting instead, trusting that a way exists, while staying quietly open to recognizing it when it shows up. That shift, from desperate searching to open trust, is often the first real crack in the wheel. You may notice small things in the days that follow. An idea arriving while washing dishes. A conversation that mentions something oddly relevant. An opportunity you might have dismissed a month ago, suddenly catching your attention instead. A solution that had been there all along, but never reached your attention before. If anxiety comes up while you sit with a question, and for many people it will, that's not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's the old groove, reacting to something unfamiliar. Let it be there without fighting it. You don't need to push it away. You just don't need to follow it either. Let the question become more important than the fear, even if only for tonight. And here's the part one find most reassuring. Your mind doesn't stop working on a real question just because you've stopped consciously thinking about it. It keeps working while you sleep, quietly in the background, the way it solves a forgotten name hours after you've stopped trying. You're not asking for a miracle tonight. You're simply asking your mind a different question than the one it's been asking automatically for years. The will doesn't stop because you fought it. Slows because, for the first time, you touched the axle. An idea like this can stay beautiful and still change nothing, if it never leaves the quiet moment where you first heard it. So let's talk about where it actually lives. In the ordinary corners of an ordinary day. Picture her again. The one who holds her breath before the banking app loads. Now picture the same moment weeks from now, after she's practiced this a handful of times. She still feels the old pull, the tightening, the bracing, the reflex to expect the worst. That part doesn't vanish overnight, and Florence never promised it would. But now, in that half second before the screen loads, she has something new available to her. Not a forced smile. Not a denial of what's actually there. Just a quiet, familiar question, waiting where the dread used to sit alone. How can I access the wealth that is already my birthright? She doesn't need a special hour or a closed door every time. The question fits into small spaces. The walk to the mailbox before opening a bill, the pause before clicking pay now, the moment right after a hard conversation about money. Anywhere the old groove used to run automatically, there's now room for something else to run instead. Before paying a bill, instead of the familiar bracing, she asks it quietly. Not to make the bill smaller. Not to pretend it isn't due. Just to interrupt for a few seconds the automatic story that usually follows. There's never enough, and replace it with an open question instead of a closed conclusion. At night, before sleep, is where Florence considered this practice most powerful. The mind is quieter then, less defended, more willing to carry a question into rest instead of a rehearsed fear. So the last thought of the day becomes, gently, not how will I get through tomorrow, but how is my birthright already finding its way to me? And slowly, something else begins to return. Not just a different relationship with money, but a different relationship with yourself. This isn't about repeating the question 50 times, or turning it into another rigid rule to fail at. Florence's teaching was never about performance. Some days she'll only remember it once. Other days 3 or 4 times. Either is enough. A groove worn over years doesn't need to be replaced all at once. It needs to be interrupted often enough that a new path slowly becomes just as familiar as the old one. Because peace was never the absence of fear. Peace was the moment fear stopped making every decision for you. Over days, then weeks, the practice stops feeling like an exercise at all. It starts feeling like a habit, the same way the old dread once did. Except now, the groove runs in a direction that opens things instead of one that closes them. That's the part Florence understood so clearly. And the part this whole video has been circling back to. The wheel was never going to stop from a single dramatic moment. It slows the same way it sped up. One small, repeated choice at a time, mostly invisible to anyone watching from the outside, and eventually undeniable to the person living it. Let's not talk about money for a moment. Let's talk about what actually changes underneath it. Because the real transformation Florence described was never about a bigger number on a screen. It was about something quieter, something almost nobody puts into words when they talk about financial healing. It's opening the banking app and feeling. Nothing dramatic. No held breath. Just a number, looked at the way you'd glance at the weather. It's paying a bill without the small performance of guilt that used to follow. No, I shouldn't have. No silent apology to no one in particular. Just an envelope, opened, handled, set down. It's buying groceries and letting yourself choose what actually sounds good, instead of calculating the cheapest version of everything out of a fear that isn't really about the money at all. It's falling asleep without doing math in the dark. It's waking up without the day's first thought being a countdown of what's due and when. None of this requires becoming a different person. It doesn't require a bigger income, though that may come too in its own time. What it requires is what you've been practicing this entire video. Noticing the wheel, touching the axle, asking a different question than the one fear used to ask automatically. Florence believed that when a person stops living inside that cycle, something in them softens permanently. Not because life stops presenting bills or hard months, but because those things stop being treated as verdicts. They become simply things that happen. Manageable, ordinary, no longer proof of anything. If something in tonight's video found you at exactly the right moment, I'd love for you to do one small thing before you go. Write 3 words in the comments. I choose abundance. Not because words magically change your circumstances, but because every transformation begins with a decision of what you will no longer allow fear to control. And if this way of thinking about money feels different from anything you've tried before, quieter, more honest, less about chasing and more about becoming someone the old fear doesn't recognize anymore, consider staying. Subscribing costs nothing, and it simply means this conversation continues, one principle at a time the next time you need it. Because peace was never the absence of fear. It was the moment fear stopped making every decision for you. Before you go, let's do one last thing together. Nothing complicated, just a breath. Breathe in slowly. And as you breathe out, let your shoulders drop, just slightly, the way they do when something you were carrying has finally been set down. Tonight, don't ask how you'll escape anything. Ask yourself something gentler instead. What if I no longer had to earn peace? What if it was simply mine to receive? Carry that question into your sleep. Not to solve it, just to hold it, the way you'd hold something fragile and new. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives the way morning does. Quietly, a little more light with each breath, until you look up and realize the room isn't dark anymore. You don't have to force anything tonight. You only have to allow it. The seed has been planted. Let it rest. Sleep well.